The telegram arrived at the Philadelphia boarding house on a morning so cold that ice had formed on the inside of Julia's bedroom window, and within its terse lines lay news that would forever alter the trajectory of her carefully planned life. Julia Lancaster pressed her gloved fingers against the yellow paper, reading once more the words that seemed impossible to comprehend. Her Uncle Thomas had died somewhere in the Colorado mountains, leaving her his entire estate in a place called Victor, a mining town she had never heard of until this frigid January morning in 1891. The lawyer's message was brief and businesslike, explaining that her presence was required to settle the inheritance, and that travel arrangements had been made for her departure within the week. She stood by the frosted window of her small room, watching the gray streets of Philadelphia below where men in dark coats hurried past, and carriages splashed through half-frozen puddles. At 23, Julia had spent her entire life in the ordered confines of the city, first in her parents' home until their deaths from fever 3 years prior, then in this respectable boarding house for young women of good families who had fallen on difficult times. She worked as a seamstress in a shop on Market Street, stitching elaborate dresses for wealthy women whose lives seemed as distant from her own as the moon. The idea of traveling alone to the wild frontier terrified her. Everything she knew about the West came from penny dreadfuls and sensational newspaper accounts of shootouts and savage attacks. Yet what choice did she have? The lawyer's letter mentioned property and assets of considerable value. With such an inheritance, she might finally escape the precarious existence that had defined her life since her parents' deaths. 5 days later, Julia stood on the platform of the Pennsylvania Railroad station with a single trunk containing everything she owned. Her traveling dress was a practical dark blue wool, her hair pinned severely beneath a modest hat. The journey would take her across the continent by rail, a trip that even now, in this modern age, still required days of travel through landscapes she could scarcely imagine. The train carried her westward through Pennsylvania's rolling hills, across the flat expanses of Kansas, where the sky seemed impossibly vast, and finally into Colorado territory, where the Rocky Mountains rose like the spine of some sleeping giant. Julia watched it all through the window with a mixture of fear and wonder, pressed into her seat as the train climbed higher into elevations that made her ears pop and her head ache. When she finally disembarked at the Victor station in late January, the thin mountain air hit her like a physical blow. The town sat at over 9,000 feet, perched on the slopes of Battle Mountain in what locals called the greatest gold camp on earth. Buildings of raw lumber lined muddy streets where men in rough clothes moved with purpose between saloons, assay offices, and supply stores. The sound of stamp mills crushing ore echoed through the valley, a constant industrial thunder that never ceased. Julia stood on the wooden platform clutching her carpetbag, her trunk being unloaded behind her, and felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. The cold here was different from Philadelphia's damp chill. It was sharp and dry, cutting through her wool coat as though the fabric were paper. "Miss Lancaster," a man in a gray suit approached, his face pinched with the permanent disapproval that seemed to characterize lawyers everywhere. "I am Henry Whitmore, your uncle's attorney. Welcome to Victor." He did not sound welcoming. He sounded as though her arrival was an inconvenience, which it probably was. He arranged for her trunk to be loaded onto a wagon and gestured for her to follow him down the main street. The town was a chaos of activity, even in the late afternoon. Men shouted to each other in a dozen different languages. Wagons hauled ore down from the mines while others carried supplies up. Women were scarce, and those Julia saw were either hurrying between shops with their heads down or lounging in the doorways of saloons in bright dresses that left little to the imagination. "Your uncle's property is just outside of town," Whitmore explained as they walked. "A ranch of sorts, though he was primarily interested in the mining claims attached to the land. He struck a good vein about 2 years ago and was working it with hired help." "What happened to him?" Julia asked, struggling to keep pace in her impractical city boots while avoiding the worst of the mud. "Cave in," Whitmore said shortly. "The mine collapsed. Took him and 2 other men. Terrible business, but it happens. The bodies were recovered and buried proper." He paused at a livery stable where a wagon waited. "I have arranged accommodation for you at Mrs. Ferguson's boarding house for the time being. Tomorrow we will go through the paperwork, and you can decide what you want to do with the property." "What are my options?" Julia asked. "Sell it, most likely," Whitmore said. "A woman cannot work a mining claim, and the ranch itself barely produces enough to sustain one person, let alone turn a profit. There are men who would pay good money for the land and the mineral rights. I can arrange a sale that would give you enough to return east and live comfortably, if not extravagantly." Julia nodded, though something in his certainty irritated her. She had not even seen the property yet, and already this man was planning her departure. The lawyer helped her into the wagon with perfunctory courtesy, and they rode through the streets in silence. Mrs. Ferguson's establishment was a 2-story building that looked only slightly more respectable than the saloons. The proprietress was a stern woman in her 50s who showed Julia to a small room that was clean but sparse. After Whitmore left with promises to return in the morning, Julia sat on the narrow bed and allowed herself a moment of complete panic. What was she doing here? This place was as foreign to her as the surface of Mars. The constant noise of the stamp mills, the thin air, the rough men and rougher landscape, all of it felt wrong, but she had no choice except to move forward. That evening she ate a simple dinner in Mrs. Ferguson's dining room alongside a few other guests, mostly men who barely acknowledged her presence. She retired early, exhausted from travel and altitude, and fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of collapsing tunnels and mountains that moved. The next morning, Whitmore arrived with the wagon as promised. He drove her out of town along a rutted road that climbed higher into the hills. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Stands of pine and aspen clung to the slopes, and everywhere were the scars of mining. Shafts dug into the earth, piles of tailings, wooden structures housing machinery. Yet between these marks of industry, the mountains rose in sweeping majesty, their peaks still heavy with winter snow that gleamed white against the brilliant blue sky. "Here we are," Whitmore announced, turning the wagon onto a track that led to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. "Your uncle's ranch." It was modest but more substantial than Julia had expected. A log house with a stone chimney sat at the center, smoke rising from within. Nearby were a barn, a chicken coop, and several smaller structures. The mine entrance was visible about 100 yards up the slope, marked by timber supports and a pile of broken rock. The sight of it made Julia's stomach turn, knowing her uncle had died inside that dark opening. "Who is living here?" she asked, noticing the smoke. "Your uncle's hired hand," Whitmore said. "Blake Sutton. He has been maintaining the property since your uncle's death with my authorization. He wants to buy the place, actually. Made an offer last week." They climbed down from the wagon, and Julia looked around with growing interest. Despite everything, there was something appealing about the place. It felt solid and real in a way her Philadelphia boarding house never had. The door of the house opened, and a man stepped out. Julia's breath caught slightly, though she could not have said exactly why. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who made his living through physical labor. He wore canvas pants, scuffed boots, and a shirt that had once been blue but had faded to gray. His hair was dark, a bit too long, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. But it was his eyes that struck her, pale blue and startlingly direct as they met hers. He was perhaps 27 or 28, she guessed, though the hard life of the frontier made ages difficult to judge. "Blake," Whitmore called. "This is Miss Julia Lancaster, Thomas's niece." Blake Sutton descended the porch steps with an easy, athletic grace and removed his hat. "Miss Lancaster, my condolences on your loss. Your uncle was a good man." His voice was deep and quiet, with an accent she could not quite place. Not Eastern, certainly, but not the rough drawl she had heard from some of the miners in town either. "Thank you," Julia said, suddenly aware that she was staring. She forced herself to look away, taking in the property instead. "I understand you have been caring for the place." "Yes, madam. Somebody needed to. The animals would not have survived otherwise, and the house would have fallen to ruin over the winter." "I appreciate that," Julia said. She noticed chickens scratching in a pen, and through the barn door she could see the forms of horses. "How many animals are there?" "3 horses, a milk cow, 20 chickens, and a hog," Blake said. "Your uncle ran a few cattle too, but they are up in the high pasture. Come spring, they will need to be rounded up and counted." Whitmore cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should go inside and discuss the business matters." Blake nodded and gestured toward the house. "I made coffee if you want some. It is cold today." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. A large room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace providing heat. A table and chairs occupied one corner, and a few shelves held dishes and supplies. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean and well maintained. The coffee Blake poured was strong and bitter, but the warmth was welcome. Whitmore spread papers across the table and began explaining the details of the inheritance. The property consisted of 64 acres, which included the ranch buildings, some pasture land, forest, and the mining claim. Her uncle had extracted a respectable amount of gold from the mine before the accident. There was money in a bank account in Victor, about $3,000, which represented his savings and the proceeds from his last gold shipment. "As I mentioned yesterday," Whitmore said, "Blake has made an offer on the property. $1,000 for the land, buildings, and mining rights." Julia looked at Blake, who met her gaze steadily. "That seems low," she said. "If my uncle extracted gold from that mine, surely it is worth more." "The productive vein has been exhausted," Whitmore said quickly. "And the mine itself is dangerous. It would require significant investment to make it operational again." "Then why do you want to buy it?" Julia asked Blake directly. Blake leaned back in his chair, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Because I believe there is more gold in that mountain, just not in the same place your uncle was looking. I have been studying the geology. But mining is expensive, and I would need to take out a loan to work it properly. I can afford the property, but just barely." "Other buyers would pay more," Whitmore interjected. "The Carlson Mining Company has expressed interest. They would pay $2,000. And they would tear apart the entire mountain," Blake said quietly. "Clear-cut the trees, pollute the creek, and when they are done, they will move on to the next site and leave a scar behind." Julia looked between the 2 men. "I need to think about this. Can I see more of the property?" Whitmore consulted his pocket watch with obvious impatience. "I really should return to town. There are other matters requiring my attention." "I can show Miss Lancaster around," Blake offered. "Bring her back to town this afternoon. Whitmore looked as though he wanted to object but could find no reasonable grounds to do so. "Very well. Miss Lancaster, please come to my office tomorrow morning and we will finalize the arrangements." He gathered his papers, made his farewells, and departed in the wagon, leaving Julia alone with Blake Sutton. The silence that followed was awkward. Julia walked to the window and looked out at the surrounding mountains, feeling the weight of the decision before her. "Why should I sell to you rather than the mining company?" she asked. $2,000 is twice your offer." "Because they will destroy what your uncle built," Blake said simply. He loved this land. He was not just a miner. He cared about the ranch, the animals, the whole thing. "If you sell to Carlson, within 6 months this place will be unrecognizable." "But that would not be my concern," Julia said. "I would be back in Philadelphia." "Then why are you still here?" Blake asked. It was a good question. She turned to face him. "Show me the property." Blake retrieved coats for both of them from hooks by the door. His was a heavy canvas jacket lined with sheepskin. For Julia, he produced a coat that must have belonged to her uncle, though it was reasonably clean. It was far too large, but it was warmer than her own Eastern garment. They walked the property together, Blake pointing out various features. He showed her the barn where the horses were stabled, introducing each animal by name. Her uncle's horse was a gray mare named Jessie, gentle and well-mannered. Blake's own mount was a rangy bay gelding called Red, who regarded Julia with suspicion. There was also a young paint horse that Blake explained he was training. The milk cow was in a shelter attached to the barn, and Blake demonstrated how to milk her, his strong hands working with practiced efficiency. Julia watched, fascinated despite herself. She had never been this close to the actual production of food. In Philadelphia, milk came from the milkman's wagon already bottled. "You know how to do any of this?" Blake asked. "No," Julia admitted. "I am a seamstress. I work with fabric and thread, not animals." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "It is not that hard to learn if you want to." They walked up toward the mine entrance, though Blake would not let her go too close. "It is not safe," he explained. "The supports need to be reinforced before anyone should go inside. That will cost money and time." "Is there really more gold?" Julia asked. "I think so," Blake said, "but I could be wrong. Mining is always a gamble." He pointed to the surrounding terrain. "Your uncle followed a vein that ran east to west. But the geological formation suggests there should be a north-south vein intersecting it somewhere deeper in the mountain. If I am right, it could be significant. If I am wrong, I will have wasted a lot of money and effort." His honesty was refreshing. "Where are you from originally?" Julia asked. "You do not sound like the miners in town." "Montana Territory," Blake said. "My father had a ranch up there. I worked cattle until I was 20, then came south looking for something different. Tried mining, ranching, a bit of everything. Worked for your uncle for the past year." "What happened to your father's ranch?" "Still there, far as I know," Blake said. "Run by my older brother. There was not enough to support us both, so I left." There was no bitterness in his voice, just statement of fact. They walked along a creek that ran through the property, frozen at the edges but still flowing in the center. Blake explained that in summer this was a good source of water for irrigation and the animals. He showed her stands of aspen and pine, pointing out which trees were dead and needed to be cut for firewood. He knew every inch of the land intimately, and Julia realized he had come to love this place as much as her uncle apparently had. By the time they returned to the house, Julia's city boots were thoroughly ruined and her feet were freezing, but she felt more alive than she had in years. The air was so clear it seemed to sharpen her vision, and the silence, when they stopped walking, was profound. No city noise, no constant human chatter, just the wind in the trees and the distant sound of the creek. Blake made them lunch, frying salt pork and eggs in a skillet over the fire. Julia watched him work, noting the competence of his movements. He was completely at ease in this environment in a way she could never imagine being. "You should take Carlson's offer," Blake said as they ate. "Go back east where you belong. This country is not for everyone, especially not people used to city life." "You are trying to talk me out of selling to you?" Julia asked, confused. "I am being honest," Blake said. "Winter up here is brutal. You are already struggling with the altitude and it only gets harder. Supply lines can be cut off by snow. People go crazy from isolation. Even if you sold to me, you would be stuck here until spring, and that is another 3 months at least. You would hate it by the end." "You seem very certain of what I would feel," Julia said, a bit of sharpness entering her voice. Blake shrugged. "I have seen it before. City people come west with romantic notions, then the reality hits them. This is a hard life. Why subject yourself to it when you have the means to return to comfort?" After lunch, Blake hitched up the smaller wagon and prepared to drive Julia back to town. She found herself reluctant to leave, which made no sense. This place should terrify her, and parts of it certainly did. But there was something here, something she could not quite name. On the ride back to Victor, they spoke little. Blake handled the horses with easy skill, navigating the rutted road without apparent effort. Julia found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape, as though reading a language written in stone and tree and sky. "What will you do if I sell to Carlson?" she asked finally. "Find work somewhere else," Blake said. "There are always ranches hiring or mines if it comes to that. You do not want to mine." "No," he admitted, "but I will do what I need to do." He left her at Mrs. Ferguson's boarding house as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the muddy streets. "Think hard about your decision, Miss Lancaster," he said. "Whatever you choose, make sure it is right for you." Julia spent a sleepless night weighing her options. The sensible choice was obvious. Take Carlson's $2,000, return to Philadelphia, find a better situation than the boarding house and the seamstress shop. With careful management, $2,000 could sustain her for several years, perhaps long enough to make a good marriage or establish a dressmaking business of her own. But every time she tried to imagine herself back in Philadelphia, the image felt hollow. She kept thinking about the vast sky over the ranch, the clean, cold air, the sound of silence. She thought about Blake showing her how to milk the cow, his patient hands guiding hers. She thought about her uncle, a man she had never known, who had carved out a life for himself in this impossible place. The next morning, she met with Whitmore in his cramped office above a hardware store. He had the papers already prepared for the sale to Carlson Mining Company. "Before you sign," Julia said, "I want to know exactly what my obligations would be if I decided to keep the property." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Keep it, Miss Lancaster, that would be most unwise. You have no experience with ranching or mining, no knowledge of the land, no skills relevant to survival on the frontier." "But theoretically," Julia pressed, "if I chose to stay, what would I need to do?" Whitmore sighed heavily. "You would need to maintain the property, which requires constant work. Care for the animals. You would need to decide whether to work the mine, which, as I mentioned, requires capital investment. You would need to acquire supplies and manage finances. All of this in a climate and altitude that Eastern constitutions often cannot tolerate. And you would need to do this alone, as a woman, which would make you subject to gossip and worse. What if I kept Blake on to help manage things? That would be even more scandalous," Whitmore said flatly. "An unmarried woman and an unmarried man living in proximity. Your reputation would be destroyed within a week." My reputation, Julia said slowly, is that of a poor orphan working in a dress shop. I am not sure how much lower it can sink. Miss Lancaster, please, Whitmore said. I am trying to act in your best interest. Take the money. Go home. Julia looked at the papers on his desk, the neat legal language that would transfer her uncle's dream to a mining company that would tear it apart. Something in her rebelled against it. I need more time to decide, she said. Can the property sustain itself through the winter? If someone maintains it, yes, Whitmore admitted reluctantly. Your uncle's bank account has sufficient funds to pay for supplies and labor. Then I will stay through the winter, Julia said. Come spring, I will make my final decision. Whitmore looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in Julia's expression must have stopped him. Very well. I will draw up an agreement for Blake to continue managing the property, with you as his employer. But I want it noted that I strongly advised against this course of action. Noted, Julia said. She left the office feeling light-headed, though whether from the altitude or the enormity of what she had just done, she could not say. She had just committed herself to spending the winter in a place where she knew no one and had no skills. It was possibly the most foolish decision she had ever made, but it felt right. Blake's reaction, when she returned to the ranch with the news, was harder to read. He listened to her explanation in silence, standing by the corral where he had been working with the paint horse. You are making a mistake, he said finally. Probably, Julia agreed. But it is my mistake to make. Whitmore is drawing up an employment contract. You will be paid for managing the property, and I will stay in the house. We will both maintain propriety by ensuring you sleep in the bunkhouse. She gestured to a small building near the barn that she had noticed on her previous visit. And what exactly do you plan to do all winter? Blake asked. Learn, Julia said. You said it is not that hard. Teach me. Blake pushed his hat back and studied her for a long moment. You will hate it, he predicted. By February you will be begging me to take you back to town. Maybe, Julia said, but I have to try. Can you understand that? Something shifted in his expression. Yeah, he said quietly. I can understand that. And so began the strangest winter of Julia's life. She moved her belongings from Mrs. Ferguson's boarding house to the ranch, ignoring the landlady's dire warnings about propriety and disaster. Blake cleared out one of the bedrooms for her use, the one that had been her uncle's, and he moved his own things to the bunkhouse without complaint. The learning curve was steep and often frustrating. Blake started with the basics, maintaining the fire, cooking simple meals, caring for the chickens. Julia had never realized how much work went into producing a single egg. The chickens had to be fed and watered, their coop cleaned, eggs collected twice daily. In the bitter cold of February at 9,000 feet, this meant bundling into every piece of clothing she owned and trudging through snow that sometimes reached her knees. Blake was a patient teacher, though he had a way of standing back and letting her fail when necessary. The first time she tried to milk the cow, she ended up on her backside in the straw while the cow regarded her with what looked like disdain. Blake said nothing, just offered his hand to help her up and showed her again how to position herself. You have to let her know you are in charge, he said. Animals sense uncertainty. I am very certain that I have no idea what I am doing, Julia muttered. Then be certain about learning, Blake suggested, and there might have been the ghost of a smile on his weathered face. Slowly she improved. Her hands, soft from city life and sewing work, developed calluses. Her body, accustomed to sitting at a sewing machine, began to strengthen from constant physical labor. She learned to split kindling, muck out stalls, haul water when the creek froze solid. She learned which horse would bite if you were not careful and which chickens were the best layers. Blake taught her to ride, starting with the gentle gray mare Jessie. Julia had never been on a horse before, and the first few attempts were terrifying. But Blake was right there, steadying her, adjusting her posture, his strong hands catching her when she lost her balance. "Relax," he would say. "The horse feels your tension. Trust her." Trusting anything in this environment felt impossible at first, but gradually Julia began to understand what Blake meant. There was a rhythm to life on the ranch, a set of patterns that repeated daily. Wake before dawn, start the fire, make coffee, feed the animals, eat breakfast, spend the day on endless chores, prepare dinner, care for the animals again, sleep. It was exhausting and boring and somehow deeply satisfying in ways her Philadelphia life had never been. Evenings were the strangest time. Propriety demanded that Blake sleep in the bunkhouse, which he did. But before he retired, they would often sit by the fire in the main house, too tired to move. Blake would mend tack or sharpen tools while Julia sewed, repairing their worn clothing with skills that finally had practical application. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Julia learned his story in fragments. He had grown up rough, the youngest of 3 brothers on a hardscrabble ranch in Montana. His mother had died when he was young. His father was a hard man, fair but demanding. Blake had left at 20 not from anger but from necessity. He had worked cattle drives, breaking horses, 1,000 odd jobs across the West. He had killed 2 men in self-defense and carried the weight of that with quiet seriousness. He drank sparingly, read when he could, and had a deep love for the land that went beyond economics. In turn, Julia told him about her life in Philadelphia. The security of her childhood, her father's work as a clerk, her mother's genteel poverty after his death. The fever that took them both within a week, leaving Julia alone at 20 with no money and few prospects. The years of sewing for wealthy women while living in a boarding house, always 1 month's unpaid rent from the street. The gnawing fear that this was all her life would ever be. "You were brave to come out here," Blake said one evening as they sat by the fire. "I was desperate," Julia corrected. "That is different from brave." "I do not think so," Blake said. "Brave is doing something even though you are scared. Seems to me that is what you have been doing." Julia looked at him across the flickering firelight. She had grown accustomed to his presence in ways that should probably alarm her. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the porch, the way he cleared his throat before speaking, the rare smile that changed his entire face. She found herself watching for that smile, treasuring it when it appeared. "Why did you really want to buy this place?" she asked. "There are other ranches, other mines. Why this one?" Blake was silent for a long time. "Because your uncle was the first person who treated me like I had a brain," he said finally. "Most ranchers, they see a hired hand and figure that is all you will ever be. Thomas, he taught me about geology, about a saying, about how to read the land. He was going to make me a partner before the accident. This place feels like unfinished business." "What would you do if you owned it?" Julia asked. "Work the mine smart, not fast," Blake said. "Take out enough gold to sustain the ranch but not destroy the mountain. Build the herd. Maybe add some sheep, though cattlemen would hate that. Make it a place that could support a family." He stopped, as though realizing he had said too much. "That sounds like a good dream," Julia said softly. February gave way to March, and the winter began to loosen its grip. The days grew imperceptibly longer, the cold marginally less bitter. Julia had been at the ranch for over a month, and she had not begged Blake to take her back to town. In fact, the idea of returning to Victor, let alone Philadelphia, felt increasingly foreign. She had changed in ways that were both physical and internal. Her face had been weathered by sun and wind. Her body was stronger. But more than that, she felt different. The constant low-level fear that had characterized her Philadelphia life had faded. She was afraid of new things now, practical things like whether the spring thaw would flood the creek or whether they had enough hay to last until the pastures greened. But these were fears she could confront with action, not the helpless dread of poverty and dependence. One morning in mid-March, Blake announced they needed to ride up to check on the cattle in the high pasture. It would be an all-day trip, possibly requiring an overnight camp if they found problems. Julia's heart raced at the prospect, both from excitement and nervousness. She had become competent on horseback, but had never attempted anything like this. They left at dawn, Blake on Red and Julia on Jesse, with supplies packed on a mule. The ride up into the mountains was breathtaking in the most literal sense. The altitude and the climbing left Julia gasping, but she refused to complain. Blake set a steady pace, stopping frequently to let the animals rest and to point out features of the landscape. "There," he said at one stop, pointing to a high valley. "That is where the cattle should be, assuming they survived the winter." "Why would they not survive?" Julia asked. "Mountain lions, wolves, illness, bad luck," Blake said. "You lose animals. It is part of ranching." They found the cattle scattered across the high valley, 23 head out of the 25 that her uncle had driven up the previous fall. Blake counted and inspected them with a practiced eye, noting which cows had calves and which showed signs of injury or sickness. 2 were missing and presumed dead, but the rest were in good condition, having survived the winter on scrub grass and their own hardiness. "We will drive them down to the lower pastures in a few weeks," Blake explained. "Once the snow melts enough to make the trail safe, I will need to hire a couple of hands from town to help." They made camp in a sheltered spot near a stream. Blake built a fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon. As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of orange and gold, Julia sat wrapped in a blanket and watched the sky slowly fill with more stars than she had ever seen in her life. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. Blake nodded, his face illuminated by the firelight. "This is why I stay," he said. "For moments like this, you can have all the gold in the mountain, but this is the real treasure." Julia looked at him, at the way the firelight played across his features, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had been trying to ignore the growing feelings she had for him, telling herself it was just gratitude or proximity or the strangeness of the situation. But in that moment, she could not deny it anymore. She was falling in love with Blake Sutton. The realization terrified her. This was not part of any plan. Blake was her employee, though that felt like an increasingly absurd designation given that he did 90% of the work, and she was still learning the basics. More than that, she had no idea how he felt about her. He was unfailingly respectful, kind in his gruff way, patient with her endless questions and mistakes. But did he see her as anything more than his employer, or worse, a burden he had taken on out of loyalty to her dead uncle? "We should get some sleep," Blake said, breaking into her thoughts. "Long ride back tomorrow." He had set up 2 bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining propriety even in the wilderness. Julia crawled into hers, still fully dressed except for her boots, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the night. She had grown accustomed to the ranch, but this was different. Wild country, truly wild, where they were not the only creatures moving in the darkness. "Blake," she said into the darkness. "Yeah, thank you for bringing me up here, for teaching me all of this. I know I have been more trouble than I am worth." "You are learning," Blake said. "That counts for something. Get some sleep, Julia." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice did something to her heart. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the impossible situation she was in. She could not stay here forever in this strange limbo. Employer and employee, woman and man, dancing around proprieties that felt increasingly ridiculous given their isolation. But what was the alternative? The ride back the next day was quieter. Blake seemed preoccupied, his usual careful attention to his surroundings taking on a distant quality. Julia wondered what he was thinking but did not ask. They reached the ranch by late afternoon, both exhausted and saddle-sore. That evening, Blake did not come to the house for dinner. Julia ate alone, feeling the silence press against her in ways it had not before. When full darkness had fallen and he still had not appeared, she pulled on her coat and walked to the bunkhouse. She knocked on the door. "Blake." "Are you all right?" A long pause. "I am fine, just tired. Can I come in?" Another pause. "That would not be proper." Julia pushed the door open anyway. The bunkhouse was small and spare, containing a narrow bed, a chair, a small stove. Blake sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and there was something raw in his expression that she had never seen before. "Julia, you should not be here." "Why not?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "We have been alone together for months. We have slept 30 feet apart, worked side by side, shared meals." "What difference does a door make?" "All the difference," Blake said roughly. He stood up, and the small space made him seem even larger. "You do not understand what people will say, what they already are saying." "Whitmore has been asking questions, checking to make sure I am sleeping out here and not in the house. Mrs. Ferguson spreads gossip every time you come to town. They are waiting for you to make a mistake so they can judge you." "I do not care what they think," Julia said. "You should," Blake said. "You are not like me. You have the chance to go back to have a real life. Do not throw that away for something that cannot work." "What cannot work?" Julia asked, her heart pounding. "Be specific, Blake." He looked at her and she saw the war in his eyes. "This," he said finally. "Us. Whatever this is becoming. You are my employer. You are a lady from Philadelphia. I am a ranch hand who has been drifting most of his life. There is no scenario where this ends well." "What if I do not care about scenarios?" Julia said, moving closer. "What if I only care about what is real?" "Julia, do not do this," Blake said, but his voice was weakening. "Do what?" she asked. "Tell you that I have feelings for you, that I think about you constantly, that I have been lying in my bed at night wishing things could be different." "Stop," Blake said, but he did not move away. "Why?" Julia asked. "Because you do not feel the same way. If that is true, then tell me and I will leave you alone. But if you do feel something, then why are we pretending?" Blake made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a groan. "Of course I feel something. I have felt it since the day you showed up in your ridiculous city clothes, looking terrified and determined all at once. I have watched you break blisters on your hands learning to work. I have seen you fall and get back up. I have listened to you talk by the fire and wanted nothing more than to close the distance between us. But wanting something does not make it right." "Then what makes it right?" Julia demanded. "You tell me, Blake. What has to happen for this to be acceptable?" "You would have to want to stay," Blake said. "Really stay. Not just for a season or until you get bored. You would have to understand that this life is hard and does not get easier. You would have to be willing to face the judgment and the talk. And I would have to be able to offer you something more than a failing ranch and a dream of finding gold that might never materialize." "What if all I want is you?" Julia asked. Blake closed his eyes. "That is the altitude talking, or the isolation. Come spring, you will feel differently." Julia stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "Look at me," she said. "Look at me and tell me you believe that." Blake opened his eyes and the naked longing in them took her breath away. "I cannot," he whispered. "God help me, Julia, I cannot." He closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her with a desperate intensity that spoke of months of restraint breaking all at once. Julia responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss was everything her limited experience had never prepared her for, urgent and tender and absolutely right. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "This is a mistake," he said. "Probably," Julia agreed, "but I am making it anyway." Blake laughed, a real laugh, and the sound of it was wonderful. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met." "I learned from a good teacher," Julia said. They stood there in the small bunkhouse, holding each other as the reality of what they were doing sank in. This was not Philadelphia, where courtships were carefully chaperoned and marriage proposals were negotiated like business contracts. This was the frontier, where people made their own rules out of necessity. "If we do this," Blake said carefully, "if we acknowledge what is between us, then we do it right. I am not going to ruin your reputation or treat you like anything less than you deserve." "What are you saying?" Julia asked. "I am saying we should get married," Blake said. "If you are staying, if this is real, then we do it proper. I am not a rich man and I do not have much to offer, but I will work hard and treat you right. That is the best I can promise." Julia felt tears prick her eyes, though she was not sure if they were from happiness or the overwhelming nature of everything happening. "Are you proposing to me?" "I guess I am," Blake said, and now there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Though I am doing a pretty terrible job of it. I should probably get down on one knee or something, but there is not much room in here for that." "I do not need you on your knee," Julia said. "I just need an answer to one question." "What question?" "Do you love me?" Julia asked. "Not just want me or feel obligated to me, but actually love me." Blake cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Yes," he said simply. "I love you. I have been fighting it for weeks, but yes. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to give up even when you are terrible at something. I love that you came out here to this impossible place and made it yours. I love you, Julia Lancaster." "Then yes," Julia said, tears now flowing freely. "Yes, I will marry you, and I love you too, Blake Sutton. You taught me what living really means. You showed me that I could be more than I thought I was. How could I not love you?" He kissed her again, softer this time, sealing the promise between them. When they finally left the bunkhouse and walked back to the main house together, the stars were brilliant overhead and the night air was crisp and clean. Julia felt as though she had stepped into a new life, one she was choosing rather than one that was being forced upon her by circumstance. The next morning they rode into Victor together to speak with Whitmore and arrange the wedding. The lawyer was clearly shocked by the announcement, though he tried to hide it behind professional courtesy. "This is rather sudden," he said carefully. "Not really," Blake replied. "We have been living in proximity for months. We know each other better than most couples do before marriage. Still, Miss Lancaster, you should consider carefully. Marriage is a significant commitment, and if things do not work out, you would have very little recourse." "I have considered," Julia said firmly. "I want to do this." Whitmore sighed but began making arrangements. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony in the small church on the edge of Victor. There were few witnesses, Whitmore and his clerk, Mrs. Ferguson, who came out of curiosity and potential scandal, and a few of Blake's acquaintances from town. The preacher was a young man newly arrived from Denver, who seemed happy to have something to do besides minister to miners with broken bodies and broken souls. Julia wore the best dress she had brought from Philadelphia, altered slightly to account for the weight she had lost over the winter. Blake wore clean clothes and looked uncomfortable but determined. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, Julia said yes without hesitation. When Blake made the same vow, his voice was steady and sure. They exchanged simple gold bands that Blake had purchased in town, and then they were married. Julia Lancaster became Julia Sutton, and the course of her life was irrevocably altered. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and that night Blake moved his belongings from the bunkhouse into the main house, into Julia's room, their room. Julia was nervous, as any new bride would be, but Blake was patient and gentle, and the awkwardness eventually gave way to tenderness and then to passion. When Julia woke the next morning to find Blake beside her, his arm across her waist, she felt a contentment she had never known before. Spring came properly to the mountains, transforming the landscape from brown and white to green and gold. They drove the cattle down from the high pasture with help from 2 hired hands, and the animals spread across the lower meadows, fattening on new grass. The creek swelled with snowmelt, and Blake used the water to irrigate the kitchen garden that Julia planted with seeds ordered from a catalog. She learned to grow vegetables, to preserve food, to turn milk into butter and cheese. Blake taught her to shoot, setting up targets behind the barn and patiently correcting her aim until she could reliably hit what she was aiming at. It was a necessary skill, he explained, for dealing with predators and for hunting. In late April, Blake decided it was time to reopen the mine. He hired an engineer from Victor to assess the damage and supervise the installation of new supports. The work was expensive, eating into the money Julia had inherited, but Blake was convinced it was worth the investment. Julia watched him work with a small crew of miners, her heart in her throat every time he disappeared into that dark opening in the mountain. She understood now why her uncle had loved this place enough to die for it, but she also understood the terrible cost that love could exact. Blake was careful, methodical, refusing to take shortcuts. The work progressed slowly. They shored up the unstable sections, removed debris, and pushed deeper into the mountain following the geological formations Blake had studied. Julia learned to help with the surface work, sorting ore, operating the small sluice they built to wash out the gold. Summer came, hot and bright at high altitude, and the ranch flourished. The cattle multiplied, calves growing strong on good pasture. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat, and Julia learned to preserve the excess. They hired a local woman to help with the harvest, and she taught Julia techniques for canning and drying that would sustain them through the next winter. In August, Blake found the vein he had been looking for. Julia was at the mine entrance when he emerged from the shaft, his face blackened with rock dust but his eyes blazing with excitement. "It is there," he said, "just like I thought, a north-south vein intersecting the old one. Julia, this is significant." They extracted the gold carefully, taking only what the vein offered without destroying the mountain to get at it. Blake worked with a reverence for the earth that Julia found beautiful. He was not a man driven by greed, but by the challenge of the work itself and the desire to build something lasting. By September, they had taken enough gold from the mine to pay off all their debts and begin putting money aside for expansion. Blake wanted to buy more cattle and perhaps some sheep, despite the social stigma. He talked about building a better barn, about digging a proper well, about all the improvements that would transform the ranch from subsistence to prosperity. But even more than the material improvements, Julia treasured the life they had built together. She loved the rhythm of their days, the hard work and simple pleasures. She loved working alongside Blake, their hands often touching as they moved around the ranch. She loved the evenings when they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, Blake's arm around her shoulders, talking about their plans and dreams. In October, Julia realized she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, a collection of small signs that eventually added up to certainty. She was both thrilled and terrified. Bringing a child into this harsh environment seemed like an enormous risk, but it also felt like the natural continuation of the life they were building. She told Blake on a crisp autumn evening as they sat by the fire. He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, and then he smiled. A real smile, bright and unguarded, that transformed his weathered features. "We are going to have a baby?" he asked, as though he needed confirmation. "Yes," Julia said. "In the spring, I think. April or May." Blake pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I will build you a proper cradle," he said, "and we will need to expand the house, add another room. And we should hire help. You cannot be doing heavy work once you start showing. And we need to make sure we have enough supplies laid in. We cannot risk you having to make the trip to town in winter." Julia laughed at his sudden flood of planning. "Blake, we have time." "The baby is not coming tomorrow." "I know," he said, "but I want everything to be perfect. You and this baby, you are everything to me. I need you safe." "We will be safe," Julia promised. "We will figure it out together." As winter settled over the mountains again, they prepared for the baby's arrival. Blake did indeed build a cradle, working on it by firelight in the evenings with a care and attention to detail that made Julia's heart ache. He carved animals into the headboard, horses and deer and eagles, all the creatures that shared their mountain home. Julia sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric she ordered from Denver. Her seamstress skills finally applied to something that filled her with joy rather than just necessity. She prepared the small second bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow that seemed to capture sunlight even on the darkest days. They were snowed in for much of January and February, but unlike the previous winter, Julia did not mind. She was with Blake in their home, waiting for their child. What more could she need? The baby came in late April, just as the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the high meadows. The birth was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from Victor who had made the journey up to the ranch despite the muddy roads. Blake paced outside for hours, helpless and terrified in a way that mining tunnels and wild animals had never made him. When the midwife finally called him in, Julia was exhausted but smiling, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "It is a boy," she said. "A son." Blake approached slowly, as though afraid he might break something, and looked down at the red, squalling infant in his wife's arms. "He is perfect," he breathed. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. "Thomas," Blake said without hesitation. "After your uncle. He brought us together in a way, seems right." "Thomas Sutton," Julia said, testing the name. "I like it." Blake sat carefully on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Julia, and together they looked at their son. In that moment, Julia felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This rough cowboy beside her, this tiny baby in her arms, this wild and beautiful land outside their door, this was her life now. Not the life she had planned in Philadelphia, but something infinitely better. Thomas was a healthy baby, strong, lunged, and demanding, and he transformed the ranch in ways both wonderful and exhausting. Sleep became a precious commodity. The sounds of the house changed, now punctuated by cries and coos and the soft sounds of nursing. Blake was a devoted father, willing to walk the floor with a fussy baby for hours, to change diapers with the same patient competence he brought to every task, to sing rough lullabies in his deep voice that somehow always soothed the boy to sleep. As spring turned to summer, life settled into new rhythms. Julia managed the house and the baby while Blake worked the ranch and the mine. They hired a young man from town to help with the heavier work, and gradually the ranch continued to grow. The cattle herd expanded. Blake did buy sheep, weathering the disapproval of neighboring cattlemen with his usual quiet determination. The mine continued to produce, not in massive quantities, but in a steady stream that provided financial security. Years passed, each marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their son's growth. Thomas took his first steps in the kitchen where Julia had first learned to cook. He spoke his first word, "Papa," while watching Blake work in the barn. He grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who wanted to be wherever his father was, imitating everything the man did. When Thomas was 3, Julia became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. The baby, a girl they named Margaret, arrived in the early autumn, smaller and quieter than her brother had been, but with the same determined spirit. Blake held his daughter with a tenderness that made Julia fall in love with him all over again. He was so strong and rough, this man who could break horses and work ore from stone, but he cradled his tiny daughter like she was made of glass. "She has your eyes," he told Julia. "Same color, same shape. And she will have your stubbornness," Julia predicted. "God help us both." As the children grew, the ranch prospered. Blake's careful management and Julia's hard work transformed the property into one of the most successful small operations in the Victor area. They were not wealthy by city standards, but they had everything they needed and more. Good land, healthy animals, a productive mine, and most importantly, each other. Julia sometimes thought about her life in Philadelphia, that gray existence of boarding houses and sewing shops. It felt like something that had happened to a different person. The woman she had been then would not recognize the woman she had become. Strong, capable, weathered by sun and work, deeply happy in ways that transcended comfort or ease. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Blake surprised her with a trip to Denver. They left the children with the hired help and took the train down from the mountains into the city. Julia had not been to a real city since leaving Philadelphia, and Denver seemed both familiar and foreign. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, attended a theatrical performance. It was lovely, but by the second day Julia was restless. "Are you all right?" Blake asked as they walked through the city streets. "I miss home," Julia admitted. "I miss the children and the ranch. Is that strange?" Blake smiled. "No, I feel the same way. The city is fine for a visit, but it is not where we belong anymore." They returned to Victor the next day, both of them eager to see their children and get back to the familiar routines of ranch life. As they rode up the familiar road to the property, Julia looked at the log house and the barn and the mountains rising behind them, and felt a surge of pure love for this place that had given her everything. Thomas was 6 now and Margaret 3, both healthy and happy and wild in the way of children raised with space to run. Thomas was already helping his father with simple ranch tasks, feeding chickens and gathering eggs with the same serious concentration Blake brought to everything. Margaret was quieter but observant, content to sit and watch the world around her with calm interest. Julia taught them both to read from the few books they owned and from newspapers when Blake brought them from town. She told them stories of Philadelphia and the East, but made sure they understood how lucky they were to grow up here, with clean air and freedom and parents who loved them. When Thomas was 8, Blake began teaching him to ride properly, moving beyond the gentle walks on Jesse that the boy had been doing since he was tiny. Julia watched from the corral fence as her husband patiently corrected their son's posture, explaining how to communicate with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure. "He is going to be a good rider," Blake said later. "He has good instincts." "He wants to be just like you," Julia said. "He should aim higher," Blake replied, but there was pride in his voice. Julia became pregnant a third time when Thomas was 9 and Margaret was 6. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two. She was 33 now, not old by any means, but the hard physical life of the ranch had taken its toll. The baby was born in the winter, a second son they named William, and the birth left Julia weak for weeks afterward. Blake hired additional help and took over more of the household duties, managing both the outside work and much of the indoor work while Julia recovered. It was during this time that Julia fully understood how much their roles had evolved from those first awkward months. They were true partners now, each capable of doing what the other did, working together seamlessly. William was a cheerful baby, easier than either of his siblings had been. He seemed to smile from birth, finding joy in everything around him. As he grew, his sunny disposition remained constant, bringing light to even the hardest days. The mine eventually played out, the vein exhausted after 7 years of careful extraction. Blake sealed the entrance and they held a small ceremony, thanking the mountain for what it had given them. The ranch was their primary income now, but they had saved well. The gold had purchased cattle, sheep, improvements, and a financial cushion that protected them against bad years. Julia was 40 when Thomas, now a young man of 17, announced his intention to start his own ranch. Blake helped him identify land and secure a loan, drawing on connections and reputation built over years of honest dealing. Watching her son ride off to build his own life was bittersweet, but Julia was proud of the man he had become. Strong, honest, hard-working kind. Everything his father was. Margaret, at 14, showed no interest in marrying young. She wanted to learn everything about ranching, to work alongside her father, to master skills that most people thought inappropriate for girls. Blake supported her completely, teaching her everything he would have taught a son. Julia watched her daughter grow into a young woman who could rope a steer, deliver a calf, and negotiate with buyers with equal skill. William, the youngest at 8, was still finding his way. He loved the ranch but also showed an artistic bent, spending hours drawing the animals and landscapes around him. Julia encouraged this, recognizing in him something of her own creativity that had once been channeled into sewing. On a warm summer evening when Julia was 42, she and Blake sat on the porch watching the sunset. Margaret was in the barn finishing evening chores. William was inside drawing by lamplight. The sounds of the ranch were familiar and comforting. Animals settling for the night, wind in the trees, the distant rush of the creek. "Do you ever regret it?" Blake asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this?" Julia turned to look at her husband. He was 50 now, silver threading through his dark hair, his face more lined than it had been. But his eyes were still that piercing blue, and he was still the man she had fallen in love with 17 years ago. "Not even for a moment," she said. "You taught me what living really means. Not just existing, not just surviving, but really living. Being scared and doing things anyway. Working hard for something that matters. Building a life with someone you love. This right here is everything I never knew I wanted." Blake reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I love you," he said. "Loved you from the moment you showed up looking terrified and determined. Love you more now than I thought possible back then." "I love you too," Julia said. "Thank you for being patient with me while I learned. Thank you for seeing something in me I did not see in myself." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The same stars Julia had seen on that first camping trip to check the cattle, the night she had realized she was falling in love. The same stars that had witnessed every moment of their life together since then. Margaret emerged from the barn and climbed the porch steps. "All done," she announced. Going to read for a bit before bed. Good night, sweetheart, Julia said. After Margaret went inside, Blake said, She reminds me of you. Stubborn, determined, refuses to accept limitations. She reminds me of you, Julia countered. Strong, capable, loves this land like it is part of her soul. Maybe she is the best of both of us, Blake suggested. Maybe they all are, Julia said, thinking of Thomas on his own ranch and William inside with his drawings. We did good, Blake. Yeah, he agreed. We did. As Julia sat there with her husband's hand in hers, looking out at the land they had built a life on, she felt a profound gratitude for the telegram that had arrived on that cold Philadelphia morning so many years ago. The news that had seemed like a disaster had actually been the beginning of everything that mattered. She had been a frightened city girl with no skills and no knowledge of the frontier. Blake had been a ranch hand with a dream and the patience to teach her. Together they had created something neither could have built alone. A thriving ranch, a family, a love that had weathered hard winters and difficult times and emerged stronger for it. More years passed, bringing their own joys and challenges. Thomas married and started his own family, eventually giving Julia and Blake 3 grandchildren who visited the ranch regularly and learned the same skills their father had learned. Margaret ran the ranch with Blake as Julia gradually stepped back from the hardest physical work, finally allowing her body to rest after decades of labor. William went to Denver to study art but returned every summer, creating paintings of ranch life that captured its beauty and difficulty with equal honesty. When Julia was 50, she and Blake celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering of family and friends at the ranch. The house they had expanded over the years was filled with people. Their children and grandchildren, neighbors, hired hands past and present. Even old Whitmore, who was now retired, but still liked to tell the story of the stubborn Eastern woman who had refused his advice and thrived anyway. Blake stood up to make a toast, his hand steady as he raised his glass. To my wife, he said, who came to this ranch knowing nothing and learned everything, who had the courage to choose this life when she could have chosen comfort, who made me believe that dreams could come true if you worked hard enough and loved deeply enough. Julia, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Julia felt tears on her cheeks, but did not bother to wipe them away. To Blake, she replied, raising her own glass. Who taught me what living really means? Who showed me that I was stronger than I thought? Who loved me when I was useless and still loves me now? You gave me everything, including myself. They kissed while their family and friends cheered, and Julia thought about the journey that had brought them here. All those days of learning and failing and trying again. All those nights by the fire, talking and dreaming. All those moments of fear and triumph and ordinary contentment that added up to a life well lived. As the party continued around them, Blake leaned close and whispered, "Want to take a walk?" Julia nodded, and they slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand up the path toward the sealed mine entrance. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. At the mine, they stopped and looked back at the ranch below. The house with its warm lights, the barn and outbuildings, the pastures where cattle and sheep grazed, the garden where vegetables grew. All of it built from determination and love. "I wonder what your uncle would think," Blake said, "if he could see what became of his place." "I think he would be happy," Julia said. "I think he would be glad his death brought me here, even though it was a terrible price to pay. I hope he knows, wherever he is, that his sacrifice gave us everything." Blake pulled her close, and they stood together as they had stood so many times over the years, watching their world. Julia rested her head against his shoulder and felt his strength and warmth, as solid and reliable as the mountains themselves. "Thank you," she said softly, For everything. For being patient when I could not even milk a cow properly. For loving me when I was just a scared girl from Philadelphia. For building this life with me. Thank you for taking a chance on me, Blake replied. For seeing past the rough cowboy to the man underneath. For staying when it would have been easier to leave. For making every day of the last 25 years worth living. They walked back to the house as the stars emerged, the sounds of their family's laughter drifting on the evening air. Julia thought about that first winter when she had been so uncertain, so afraid, so convinced she would fail. She thought about Blake standing back and letting her learn, offering his hand only when she truly needed it. She thought about the moment in the bunkhouse when they had finally admitted what they felt, breaking every rule of propriety and choosing their hearts instead. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choices again. Every difficult moment, every callous and sore muscle, every winter of isolation and summer of hard work, all of it had been worth it. Because it had led to this, a life of meaning and purpose and love. Inside the house, their family was still celebrating. Margaret had taken out her father's old fiddle and was playing while William sang. The grandchildren were dancing, their laughter bright and pure. Thomas and his wife were swaying together, clearly in love despite years of marriage, continuing the legacy their parents had begun. Julia and Blake stood in the doorway watching, and Blake put his arm around her waist. "This is what success looks like," he said. "Not gold or money, though those are nice, but this, family, love, people who will carry on what we started. And each other," Julia added. "Still. After all these years." "Especially each other," Blake agreed. They joined the celebration, dancing together in the crowded room with the ease of long practice. Julia closed her eyes and let herself be held by the man who had changed her life, who had shown her what she was capable of, who had loved her through transformation and growth, and all the challenges that life on the frontier demanded. When she was young in Philadelphia, Julia had thought love would be something gentle and refined, conducted in parlors over tea. She had never imagined it would be this. Raw and powerful, built through shared struggle and mutual respect, forged in a harsh land that demanded everything and gave back only what you earned. But this love, hard-won and constantly tested, was real in ways parlor romance could never be. It was Blake's hands, scarred from work, holding hers with infinite gentleness. It was the way they moved together through their daily routines, anticipating each other's needs without words. It was the shared glances across a crowded room that spoke volumes. It was 25 years of choosing each other, every single day, even when it was difficult. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Julia and Blake stood on the porch bidding farewell. Margaret would stay at the ranch as she always did, and William planned to remain for a few more weeks. Thomas and his family would return to their own ranch, lives that paralleled their parents in many ways. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road and the house was finally quiet, Blake and Julia prepared for bed in the room they had shared for a quarter-century. Julia brushed out her hair, now more silver than brown, and watched Blake in the mirror as he removed his boots. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her gaze. "About that first winter," Julia said, "when I did not know anything and you had to teach me everything, when I thought I would never belong here." "You belonged here from the start," Blake said. "You just did not know it yet." "How did you know?" Julia asked. "What made you believe I could do this?" Blake came to stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders. "Because you did not give up," he said simply. "The first time you fell trying to milk the cow, you got back up. The first time the altitude knocked you down, you caught your breath and kept walking. You were scared, but you did it anyway. That is what told me you would make it." Julia turned to face him, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "I love you so much," she said. "More now than ever, though I did not think that was possible." "I know," Blake said. "I feel the same way. Every year I think I cannot possibly love you more, and every year I am proven wrong." They went to bed and lay together in the darkness, Blake's arm around Julia as it had been on countless nights before. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the creek flowed, and the mountains stood eternal. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds held each other close and counted their blessings. The years continued to pass, as years do. Julia and Blake grew older, their bodies bearing the marks of hard lives well lived. They watched their children and grandchildren grow and thrive. They saw the ranch continue to prosper under Margaret's capable management. They welcomed William's wife when he finally married and started his own family in Denver while maintaining his connection to the ranch that had shaped him. When Blake was 65, he had a bad fall from a horse and broke his leg. It healed slowly, and he never quite regained his former mobility. But he adapted, finding ways to contribute despite his limitations. Julia, at 60, had her own challenges with arthritis in her hands, the legacy of all those years of hard work. But she too adapted, teaching their grandchildren while Margaret and the hired hands did the heaviest labor. They talked often about the past, remembering their years together with fondness and wonder. Blake would tell the story of Julia's first attempt at milking the cow, making her laugh even after all the years. Julia would remind him of the camping trip when he had used her given name for the first time, and how her heart had leaped at the sound. "We have had a good run," Blake said one evening as they sat on the porch. He was 70 now, Julia was 68, and they had been married for 43 years. "We are not done yet," Julia protested. "No," Blake agreed. "But when the time comes, I want you to know I have no regrets. Everything I did, everything we built, it was all worth it." "Do not talk like that," Julia said. "You are going to outlive us all just to be stubborn." Blake laughed, that same wonderful sound that had first made her fall in love with him. "Maybe, but just in case I wanted to say it." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the mountains they had called home for so long. Julia reached for Blake's hand, and he took it with the gentle strength that had never wavered in all their years together. "You taught me what living really means," Julia said softly, echoing words she had spoken before but that never lost their truth. "Every day with you has been a gift. When I think about the telegram that brought me here, I am grateful for every moment since." "You taught me what love means," Blake replied. "Real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that makes everything else worthwhile. Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me." "I would choose you again," Julia said. "Every time in every life I would choose you." As the stars emerged and the night settled over the ranch, they remained on the porch, two people who had built an extraordinary life out of ordinary materials. Work and love and determination. They had taken an impossible situation and made it work through sheer force of will and deep connection. The ranch would continue after them. Their children would carry on, and their grandchildren after that. The house they had expanded and improved would shelter new generations. The land they had tended so carefully would remain productive. But more than any physical legacy, they had created something else. A story of transformation and courage and love that would be told and retold, inspiring others to take their own chances and build their own dreams. As Julia sat with Blake's hand in hers, she felt complete. The frightened girl from Philadelphia was gone, replaced by a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply. She had learned to ride and work and survive in a harsh land. She had borne children and raised them well. She had built a partnership with a remarkable man that had sustained them both through every challenge, and through it all, Blake had been there, teaching her, supporting her, loving her. He had seen potential in her that she had not seen in herself. He had been patient when patience was needed and firm when she required pushing. He had loved her when she was useless and when she was capable, through beauty and weathering, through youth and age. This was what living meant. Not the safe, constrained existence she had known in Philadelphia, but this wild, difficult, glorious life they had built together on a Colorado mountainside. Every scar and callus, every wrinkle and gray hair, they were medals earned through truly living. Margaret came out onto the porch. "You two should come inside. It is getting cold." "In a minute," Blake said. Margaret smiled, understanding. She had grown up watching her parents love, and it had shaped her expectations of what a relationship should be. "Do not stay out too long," she said, and went back inside. "She is a good girl," Blake said. "All of them are." "We did well," Julia agreed. "They are our greatest achievement." "No," Blake said, squeezing her hand. "You are my greatest achievement. Everything else came from what we built together." Julia rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The same stars that had watched them fall in love, that had witnessed their vows, that had seen them build their life piece by piece. In the distance, a coyote called. The wind rustled through the aspens, making the leaves whisper. The creek sang its eternal song. And on the porch of the ranch they had built together, two people sat in perfect understanding, their love as strong as it had ever been, their commitment unshaken by time or hardship. This was their legacy. Not just land or buildings or money, but a love that had transformed them both, that had proven it was possible to choose your own path and find happiness in unexpected places. Julia had come to the frontier a frightened stranger, and Blake had shown her how to belong. Together, they had created something that would outlast them both, not just in their children and grandchildren, but in the example they set of what two people could accomplish when they chose each other and refused to give up. As the night deepened and the cold finally drove them inside, Julia looked back at the mountains one more time. They stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to everything that had happened here. And she smiled, knowing that she had left her mark on this land as surely as it had left its mark on her. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming. Margaret had kept the fire going, and the room smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Blake helped Julia to their room, his movements slower now but still careful and attentive. They prepared for bed with the ease of long habit, each anticipating the other's needs. As they lay together in the darkness, Julia spoke into the quiet. "Promise me something." "Anything," Blake said. "Promise me you will tell our grandchildren our story. How we met, how we fell in love, all of it. I want them to know that it is possible to be scared and do things anyway. That love is real when you work for it. That living fully is worth every risk." "I promise," Blake said, "though they might not believe that you once could not milk a cow." Julia laughed softly. "Tell them anyway. Tell them I was useless and you taught me everything. Tell them that coming to this ranch was the best decision I ever made, even though it terrified me. Tell them that their grandfather was the finest man I ever knew, and that loving him was the easiest thing I ever did, even when everything else was hard." "I will tell them," Blake promised, "and I will tell them about you. How you came here with nothing but courage, how you learned and grew and became the strongest person I know. How you made this ranch a home, how you loved me when I did not think I deserved love. I will tell them everything." They drifted off to sleep together, secure in the life they had built and the love they shared. And if tomorrow brought new challenges, they would face them together, as they always had, because that was what living really meant. Not the absence of fear or difficulty, but the presence of love and commitment strong enough to weather anything. Julia had learned that lesson from Blake, and together they had proven it true every single day for more than 4 decades. Their story was one of courage rewarded, risks worth taking, and love that transformed everything it touched. From a telegram in Philadelphia to a ranch in the Colorado mountains, from a frightened seamstress to a capable rancher, from employer and employee to partners in every sense of the word, they had journeyed together and arrived at a destination neither could have imagined alone. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood watch, their love endured, a testament to the power of choosing life over safety, adventure over comfort, and each other over everything else. The end.